It was a photograph. Small creased edges frayed from years of handling, hidden deep inside a man's wallet. I didn't notice it at first, just an ordinary gesture, a wallet passed from one hand to another. But then the eyes caught mine. A child's eyes. Impossibly familiar. Impossibly alive. I froze my breath, hitching, as if the air itself had thickened, holding me hostage. The room felt suddenly smaller, darker, charged with something I could not name. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering as if in anticipation. And in that instant, the world outside ceased to exist. The face in the photograph looked exactly like my daughter. The same wide eyes, the same uncertain smile, the same hint of mischief. Every feature matched, defying reason and time. I traced the lines of her mouth, the curve of her cheeks, unable to shake the sensation that she was looking straight into my soul. The photograph seemed alive, breathing in rhythm, with my own heartbeat, holding secrets no one had dared to speak. My hands trembled and a shiver ran down my spine, leaving me aware of every sound, every whisper in the room. The silence was oppressive, almost sentient, pressing in from every corner. I lifted the photograph, careful not to tear it. But the weight in my hands was heavier than it should have been. It was as if the paper itself carried the memory of another life, a fragment of a past I could neither verify nor deny. The man across from me sat quietly, watching his fingers brushing the edges of the wallet with a nervous rhythm. The photograph pulsed faintly under my touch, a rhythm in time with something ancient and unseen. Outside, Dayton moved on oblivious, its streets filled with post-war chatter and laughter. But inside, time had fractured, and reality felt thin, fragile, like a veil about to tear. The air in the room grew colder, a subtle draft curling along the floorboards and threading through the cracks in the walls. I could almost hear it whispering faint voices entwined with the rustle of paper. I sensed movement at the edge of my vision, shadows that shifted just beyond comprehension. The photograph seemed to respond, eyes glimmering in the dim light, drawing me closer to a truth I could not face. A distant clock ticked hollow and slow, marking each second with a weighty inevitability. I swallowed hard, realizing that ordinary explanations would never suffice. I asked him, voice low, almost trembling, "Who is she?" His eyes darted to the floor. Lips parted briefly, then closed as if words could not contain the memory. His hands clenched around the wallet, knuckles white, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken history. A faint sigh escaped him, barely audible, mingling with the ghostly hush in the room. Outside, children's laughter echoed, oblivious to the tension that had rooted us both to the spot. Every shadow seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. And the photograph, it watched me back, patient and unyielding. The edges of the photograph were worn, but the face remained impossibly vivid, radiant against the faded background. It drew me in a magnetic force, pulling at memory and instinct alike. I traced her features, fingertips, hovering almost afraid to make contact, as if touching might shatter the fragile line between past and present. The image seemed to pulse with life, flickering in the dim light, like a candle struggling against the wind. Every glance reinforced the impossible resemblance. Every heartbeat made the room tremble. I realized then that I had crossed a threshold into something far beyond ordinary perception. I sensed a presence, something that moved without form, lurking in the corners of my awareness. The photograph pulsed with an energy I could not name, a tether connecting me to something distant and dangerous. A cold chill slithered along my spine and my skin prickled with awareness. The soldier's gaze was fixed somewhere beyond me, as if he too could see what I could not name. Outside, the mundane world continued unaware, but inside, every object, every shadow seemed to vibrate with tension. And through it all, the photograph stared back unblinking and insistent. My mind raced questions tumbling over one another. How could this child resemble my own daughter so perfectly? Was it coincidence? Or something darker, something that defied the rules of logic? The linear flow of time, I could not reconcile the photograph with reality. Yet I could not deny the truth of what I saw. Every instinct screamed that I had glimpsed a fracture in the ordinary world, a place where memory, fate, and something unearthly intertwined. The air seemed to hum with possibilities I could neither name nor escape. I looked at the soldier again. He avoided my gaze, eyes dark with memories too sharp to voice. His hands clutched the wallet, protecting not a photo, but a fragment of something sacred, something lost. Every movement was careful, deliberate, weighed with unspoken guilt or fear. Shadows stretched across his face, deepening the lines, making him appear both older and infinitely tired. The photograph lay between us, a silent witness, a mediator of mysteries that could not be articulated. And as I stared, I understood that the room held more than just paper and memory. It held the weight of history itself. The room seemed to breathe with the photograph. Faint whispers echoed, perhaps my imagination, perhaps the memory trapped in the paper. The walls closed in slightly, the light dimming imperceptibly, as if the world was retreating, leaving only this moment, this impossibility. Every heartbeat resonated, and the photograph seemed to thrum in response, alive in a way that defied explanation. I could feel the pull, the inexorable gravity of a story I had not yet earned the right to hear. And then the reality of the impossibility hit me fully. This was not just a coincidence. This was a portal, a window into a past that should have remained hidden, a fragment of time memory, and perhaps something beyond. The girl's eyes staring into mine seemed to ask a question I could not answer. And as I held the photograph, the ordinary world slipped further away, leaving only the impossible truth staring back at me. The photograph was no longer just an object. It was alive, haunting, and eternal. Shadows lengthened, corners darkened, and the air carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. I realized then that this moment would linger forever, etched into memory, a spectral echo of what should not have been. And in that silence I understood, nothing would ever look the same again. Dayton, Ohio, 1945. The city hummed with the tentative rhythm of post-war life. Streetcars rattled along tracks, children played in yards still scarred by rationing and loss, and neighbors exchanged cautious greetings, trying to reclaim normalcy in a world that had changed too quickly. Factories that once churned out war machines now produced vacuum cleaners and kitchen appliances, and the smell of fresh paint and smoke from chimneys mingled in the warm summer air. The soldier who handed me the wallet had returned from Europe just weeks earlier. His uniform, neatly pressed, bore the faint scent of tobacco and old leather. He moved through Dayton like a shadow of the past, carrying memories heavier than any medal or certificate. Official records show he was stationed in a bombed-out village in France, one of many towns reduced to rubble where children vanished, families scattered, and lives ended in fragments. His discharge papers were clean, but the papers never capture the weight of what a man carries home. Neighbors knew him only in passing. A polite smile, a tip of the hat, a nod in the street. But inside his home, it was different. The air smelled faintly of old paper ink and smoke from a small stove. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight, yet the room seemed suspended as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of memory. Photographs lined the walls, some framed neatly, others pinned to corkboards. Each one told a story, some joyful, others impossible to reconcile with reality. Dayton itself was a city caught between hope and shadow. Factories reopened, schools filled with children in too small shoes, cafes buzzed with conversation. Yet under the surface, there lingered a tension, a residue of fear and absence that no brass plaque or newspaper report could ever capture. Reports from local police hinted at mysterious disappearances, children vanishing, families left with nothing but whispered speculation. Files now partially declassified mentioned singular disappearances, fate unknown. Circumstances unexplained, language dry and precise yet hollow, leaving as much mystery as information. The man's house overlooked a quiet street, tree-lined, neat, yet the interior felt charged. Each room carried traces of another life. A worn rocking chair slightly off-center, a clock that ticked unevenly, a photograph of a child whose eyes seemed too knowing. I noticed small details, shadows falling at strange angles, floorboards that creaked with a cadence not entirely explained by my footsteps. Fact and folklore began to blur, a subtle tension between what was and what might be. His diary's fragments, recovered later, referenced a girl, a child he had seen in Europe, sometimes in fleeting moments, sometimes in photographs he carried constantly. Names were obscured, dates, unclear locations, vague. The entries spoke of a face that haunts me, eyes I cannot forget, a smile that refuses to fade. Phrases that felt both personal and impossible to verify. Every note, every word seemed to echo with unspoken horror, hinting at a world where memory and reality collided. Outside, the city moved on. Children rode bicycles along cracked sidewalks. Street vendors hawked newspapers with headlines about rationing, returning heroes, and the slow rebuilding of daily life. Yet inside that small house, the ordinary rhythm of Dayton was suspended. Time was folded over itself, each shadow heavier than the last, each sound amplified, each photograph a silent witness to the impossible. Neighbors later recounted strange occurrences, lights flickering in empty rooms, a fleeting shadow moving just beyond the corner of the eye, soft sounds like laughter or crying when no one was present. Some dismissed it as stress, post-war anxiety, or imagination. Others whispered about the faces that follow you, images captured in photographs that seemed alive, that reflected more than reality could contain. These stories circulated quietly, an oral folklore layer beneath the city's surface, subtle, persistent, unnerving. The photograph in the soldier's wallet existed at the intersection of these layers, fact and folklore entwined. Dayton's history provided the factual backdrop, returning soldiers, fractured families, missing children, the residual trauma of war. Folklore filled in the gaps, whispers, apparitions, the sense that certain images captured more than memory, that some faces refused to remain confined to paper. I held that intersection in my hands, aware that what I saw was both real and impossible. He never offered explanations, and I never pressed further. The context was heavy enough without words. Dayton, with its post-war streets, its hum of life, and its undercurrent of shadows, set the stage for what I had glimpsed. The photograph was only the beginning. Every building, every sidewalk, every shadow held the potential for discovery or for dread. Fact and folklore intertwined, creating a tension that would guide the rest of the story. And in that house, in that city, I realized the war was not only fought overseas, it had followed us home, into our streets, our homes, our photographs. Dayton, Ohio. Ordinary on the surface, yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, the echoes of Europe lingered. Silent, insistent, impossible to ignore. Every glance at the photograph reminded me that some histories are hidden, waiting to be unearthed or perhaps to haunt those who dare look too closely. The air in the room seemed to thrum with energy, charged with memories too heavy to speak. Outside, the city's hum continued, indifferent. Inside, time was suspended, shadows stretched long, and the photograph pulsed with a quiet insistence. It was in this space between ordinary life and something unexplainable that the story would unfold, bridging past and present, fact and folklore, leaving only questions and a sense of dread that would not dissipate. Dayton's newspapers from the summer of 1945 tell a quiet story of recovery and of disappearance. Amid headlines celebrating the war's end, small notices appeared on the margins. Children reported missing names printed in crisp, black-type dates, etched into the paper with a cold precision. Official language hid terror beneath civility, singular disappearance. Fate unknown. Circumstances unexplained. Families listed addresses, last known sightings. Yet the accounts ended abruptly, as if someone had deliberately closed the page before the story could continue. Police reports from the Dayton precincts are sparse but chilling. Officers documented missing children, unexplained absences, and strange sightings near residential streets. Witnesses provided conflicting statements. One neighbor swore she saw a soldier walking a child down the avenue at dusk. Another claimed she glimpsed the child through a window alone, then vanished when she blinked. Notes scribbled in margins, later revealed in declassified files, speak of discrepancies, contradictions, and investigations quietly closed without resolution. The soldier in question appears in several of these records, not directly accused, yet mentioned in passing, a figure hovering on the edge of mystery. Official military archives complement the city records. His service file details a tour in Europe in villages bombed and abandoned, with records of civilian encounters that never made it to the public eye. Diaries recovered decades later reveal fleeting glimpses of children. Faces blurred by trauma, smiles preserved in photographs, names never recorded. One entry notes, "A girl with eyes I cannot forget. A fleeting smile. Gone before I could hold it." Another reads, "Every town carries its echoes, children lost. Faces that haunt the night." These fragments of memory intersect with Dayton's own record, forming an intricate web of fact and partial documentation, each thread taut with tension. Medical reports and hospital logs hint at another layer: children brought in with unexplained injuries or found wandering alone and disoriented. Social services documentation, later declassified, mentions cases unresolved due to lack of evidence and instances of children reunited with families under unclear circumstances. Each report offers a skeletal frame of truth, bare-boned but heavy with implication. Facts exist, yet the gaps are conspicuous, as if the documentation itself were leaving space for stories too dangerous to tell openly. Eyewitness accounts captured in interviews decades later confirm fragments of the timeline. One neighbor recalls a soldier, quiet and polite, walking through the streets with a photograph in hand, glancing at it as if the child could vanish without his attention. Another remembers a brief knock at the door in the evening, a child's voice calling from the darkness, though no child was ever there. These recollections, though anecdotal, corroborate subtle patterns found in records, instances of missing children, unexplained encounters, and the recurring presence of soldiers carrying photographs or diaries. The soldiers' personal diaries serve as the nexus of fact and subjective memory. Entries describe children encountered in Europe, faces that lingered, smiles that imprinted themselves onto his consciousness. Dates are inconsistent, locations vague, yet the intensity of observation is undeniable. One line reads, "The girl's eyes are like shadows, impossible to forget, impossible to place." Another, "Every town lost children. Every photograph is a fragment of something greater." The diaries intertwine with official documentation, offering hints, though never clear resolutions, leaving a trail of factual breadcrumbs through the fog of history. Local historians have pieced together fragments from census data, wartime records, and newspaper archives. They highlight recurring motifs: children missing, without trace, soldiers returning home carrying photographs of unknown faces, families forever unsettled. Each layer of documentation adds weight to the narrative: factual, verifiable, yet incomplete. Even the dates on photographs, often annotated in faint pencil, occasionally contradict official records, introducing the first whispers of something beyond ordinary understanding. Court and legal documents from the era provide a glimpse into the institutional response. Cases of alleged abduction or neglect rarely led to prosecution. Witness testimony was inconsistent, and evidence often vanished. Statements, lost photographs, misplaced files, misfiled or destroyed. One surviving memo notes: evidence insufficient to proceed. Case closed. Yet within that brief line lies the echo of countless mysteries, unsolved, children unaccounted for, and a community left to speculate. Even military correspondence hints at anomalies. Letters between commanders discuss civilians encountered abroad. Children seen alone in bombed villages, small towns emptied by war, families shattered. Photographs were collected for documentation purposes, some of children now missing, some of faces that would later mirror others, inexplicably familiar. Each note emphasizes precision, yet the language is taut with the tension of suppressed fear. A singular disappearance is noted casually, as though to highlight efficiency rather than tragedy. The soldier's discharge paperwork, mundane in appearance, fails to capture the enormity of what he returned with. Names, faces, photographs, scraps of memory, each a fragment. His homecoming is ordinary on paper: dates, locations, commendations, but the diaries and eyewitness accounts reveal the extraordinary. The documents suggest someone carrying a burden too large to articulate a fragment of history that straddles fact and folklore. City council archives and municipal correspondence add further texture. Mentions of missing children, neighborhood disturbances, and inexplicable sightings appear sporadically in meeting minutes. Reports indicate investigation committees convened quietly, with few conclusions. One line, understated yet chilling, reads, "Occurrences noted, further observation required." The bureaucratic language conceals anxiety and uncertainty, leaving gaps where the imagination, or perhaps memory itself, fills in what is missing. Even personal letters to family members reflect a tension between factual recounting and suppressed horror. The soldier writes cautiously, avoiding explicit details yet hinting at experiences that unsettled him profoundly. One excerpt I saw what cannot be named, and yet it remains etched into my mind. I carry it home and it follows me still. These letters bridge the gap between official documentation and lived experience, offering a human voice amidst the skeletal framework of formal records. By combining all these threads, police reports, newspaper notices, military diaries, eyewitness interviews, municipal records, and personal correspondence, a portrait emerges. It is factual, verifiable in parts, yet riddled with anomalies. Patterns of missing children, soldiers returning with photographs of faces never identified, and families left with unanswered questions paint a chilling picture. The facts exist, but never fully satisfy the mind's demand for closure. They form a lattice of reality, precise, incomplete, and suffused with a quiet, unrelenting dread. In the quiet streets of Dayton, whispers lingered, soft, almost imperceptible but persistent. Neighbors spoke of strange shadows that moved against the grain of the evening light, silhouettes that lingered in doorways then vanished when approached. Some claimed they had glimpsed children in the windows of empty houses, only to find the rooms barren moments later. Rumors spread quietly, carried in hushed tones from porch to porch, over back fences and into kitchens, where mothers listened with furrowed brows and children clutched one another. Stories of photographs that captured more than memory were common in these circles, dismissed officially, but alive in folklore. People spoke of images that seemed to watch eyes following expressions shifting subtly over days, weeks, months. A single photograph could contain a spirit, some intangible essence that clung to paper and ink. In Dayton, many claimed to have seen the same haunting face appearing where it shouldn't, echoing a life long vanished. The soldier's photograph, carried quietly in a wallet, fell exactly into this tradition, a fragment of myth enmeshed in reality. Elders spoke of the faces that follow children lost to war or circumstance, yet somehow captured in photographs that traveled far from their origins. They whispered of European towns bombed into rubble, children seen one day and gone the next, and images preserved by someone or something with a will beyond understanding. A photograph could become a vessel, a tether between worlds, binding memory trauma and the uncanny into one fragile frame. Dayton's folk memory absorbed these tales, layering them over fact, creating a texture both real and impossible. There were tales of soldiers returning home with photographs of children. They could not place faces that mirrored their own fears or desires, or sometimes those of people they had never met. It was said that looking too long at such images could invite intrusion. A shiver down the spine, a whisper in the night, a sense that the photograph watched even as the world moved on. One local woman recounted a photograph that changed each night, the eyes widening or narrowing, the smile tilting in impossible ways. No science could explain it. No record could verify it. And yet everyone who saw it remembered it vividly, etched into consciousness as though alive. In Dayton, the air after sunset often carried a subtle unease. Children would avoid certain streets, insisting they saw movement in the corner of their eyes. Dogs would growl at shadows unseen. Residents reported faint laughter on windless nights, fleeting glimpses of figures in abandoned lots, and doors opening when no one was near. The folklore blended seamlessly with real events, disappearances, photographs, soldiers carrying memories across continents, until the boundary between fact and myth blurred into a continuous, unsettling rhythm. Local storytellers added layers of symbolism to these accounts. Some believed the photographs held fragments of lost souls, echoes of children who had vanished, displaced by war, abduction, or circumstance. Others claimed the soldiers themselves became conduits, vessels for memory and trauma, carrying these fragments unknowingly across oceans and into new homes. Dayton became a crossroads of memory and myth, a place where ordinary streets hid extraordinary echoes, and a simple photograph could carry the weight of the impossible. Folklore also spoke of repetitive motifs, the same face appearing in different photographs, in different homes at different times. Some suggested that these were not coincidences, but manifestations of unresolved grief or spiritual resonance. The soldier's photograph, the one that mirrored my daughter, fit perfectly into this pattern. It became part of an invisible narrative that spanned continents, years, and tragedies, connecting lives through an eerie, almost supernatural logic. The stories were not just visual. Auditory phenomena were reported, two soft whispers at the edge of hearing laughter, with no source, footsteps in empty rooms. Residents described a feeling of being observed, a presence that could not be quantified. These sensations became part of Dayton's collective memory, layered over official records and eyewitness accounts, creating a dense tapestry of fact and superstition that was impossible to unravel. Children themselves sometimes whispered of unseen playmates, glimpses of companions who appeared only briefly, then vanished. Parents often dismissed these as imagination, yet the reports aligned disturbingly with missing persons data and photographs that arrived unbidden in households. Folklore preserved these observations, giving narrative form to phenomena that official records could not explain. Even the soldier seemed to inhabit this space of myth. He moved quietly, avoided attention, yet his presence was marked by a subtle tension. Shadows seemed to linger where he passed. Objects, photographs, papers, letters, appeared slightly altered when left alone, corners, bent ink, slightly smudged, as if the world around him were responding to forces unseen. The folklore of Dayton elevated these occurrences from mere coincidence to something charged with meaning, something beyond comprehension. Stories passed from neighbor to neighbor, each retelling, adding layers of ambiguity and suspense. The soldier's photograph became emblematic, a tangible anchor for tales of ghosts, shadows, and children who existed in a space between reality and memory. Dayton's residents, knowingly or not, participated in this ongoing narrative, a shared experience that merged lived events with legend. Through the lens of folklore, Dayton was transformed from a quiet post-war city into a liminal space, a crossroads, where past and present converged. Every photograph, every missing child, every shadow in the corner of a room became part of an unspoken story, a story that spoke of loss of war and of the uncanny persistence of memory. The soldier's photograph, now central to my own encounter, occupied a place at the heart of this mythology, a bridge between fact, fear, and the unexplainable. The photograph in the soldier's wallet was not an isolated anomaly. Across Dayton, across Ohio, even stretching into other states, stories surfaced, fragments, whispers, fleeting glimpses that hinted at a recurring motif. Children vanished. Soldiers returned. Photographs appeared inexplicably familiar, sometimes in households far from the original scene. The pattern repeated, subtle yet insistent, like a pulse beneath the surface of ordinary life. It suggested a continuity of events, a hidden thread connecting places and times, a mystery too pervasive to be coincidental. I began tracing these threads, following the faintest leads, the softest hints in police reports, diaries, letters, and oral accounts. In another town weeks earlier, a similar photograph surfaced in a soldier's wallet. A young girl, eyes wide, smile uncertain, echoing the same pattern. Families reported missing children, towns documented unexplained sightings. Each case seemed separate, yet together they formed a motif, a recurring enigma that transcended geography and circumstance. Local newspapers reported children missing without trace, with details eerily parallel across towns, the same ages, the same circumstances, the same sudden disappearance. Official reports used neutral language, circumstances remain unknown, case unresolved. Yet beneath the sterile phrasing, there was a tension, a fear, an unspoken recognition that something unusual was repeating itself. The bridge between Dayton and these other towns was invisible but undeniable, a web connecting stories that should have remained isolated. Eyewitnesses added nuance to the pattern. A teacher recalled seeing a child on the outskirts of a schoolyard, eyes fixed, expression strangely familiar, only to vanish moments later. A neighbor remembered glimpsing a soldier carrying a photograph, muttering to himself, as if the image held secrets no one else could understand. These fragments were small, yet together, they formed a bridge between fact and folklore, linking one mysterious occurrence to another, and reinforcing the sense that these events were part of a larger, almost orchestrated sequence. The motif extended beyond Ohio. Reports from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and even overseas hinted at similar phenomena. Soldiers carried photographs, children vanished under puzzling circumstances, families whispered of faces that seemed to follow them. Diaries and letters collected later described fleeting encounters with children whose presence was unexplainable. A shadow of familiarity, a trace of the impossible. The bridge connected continents as well as towns, a chain of uncanny events anchored in photographs and memories. Patterns emerged in timing, too. Most disappearances occurred during periods of transition, soldiers returning from Europe towns, shifting from wartime austerity to peacetime routine. Photographs appeared just as families attempted to regain normalcy. It was as though these images acted as conduits, stirring echoes of trauma and memory, linking individuals across vast distances and different walks of life. Fact and folklore intertwined here, forming a bridge that was both literal and symbolic. One local historian described it as an invisible river flowing beneath the surface of ordinary life, carrying fragments of lost memory and perhaps something else entirely. The bridge was not just narrative, it was experiential, affecting those who encountered it. Families felt it in subtle unease, soldiers carried it silently, and communities absorbed it collectively, imprinting the motif on cultural memory. Dayton became the focal point, the hinge between private tragedy and communal legend. Even the soldier himself seemed aware of the motif, though he never spoke of it openly. His actions, carefully documented in diaries, letters, and interviews, suggest he understood a connection between the photograph in his wallet, the children he had seen abroad, and the disappearances back home. Yet he carried the knowledge silently, the bridge existing in the space between what he knew and what he could reveal. It became a personal labyrinth linking past, present, and the impossible possibilities of human memory. The motif also took on symbolic resonance. Photographs became portals, children became archetypes, and soldiers became unwitting messengers of a phenomenon that could not be contained. The bridge connected multiple layers: factual history, personal testimony, folklore, and the uncanny. Each link reinforced the others, creating a lattice of experiences that defied ordinary explanation, yet felt undeniable in their repetition. Families discovered the motif through small coincidences, photographs appearing on doorsteps, fleeting recognitions of features in strangers, moments of déjà vu that left them unsettled. They documented these occurrences quietly, often hesitant to share, aware that society might dismiss them as coincidence, imagination, or delusion. Yet patterns persisted unbroken, forming a continuum between fact, folklore, and memory. In Dayton, the motif crystallized in the soldier's photograph. It was a nexus, the hinge where local events intersected with broader phenomena. Through it, the city's missing children, the soldiers' returning memories, and the whispers of the uncanny converged. The bridge was not merely a connection, it was an axis of tension, pulling together multiple narratives into one ominous, coherent shape. As I followed the motif, the bridge extended to me. Each document, each eyewitness account, each photograph I examined drew me deeper into a web I could not untangle. The soldier's photograph mirrored my own daughter, and the motif suggested that the thread connecting the past and present was not abstract but immediate, tangible, inescapable. Every step along the bridge led further into a shadowed landscape where fact and folklore overlapped, and the ordinary world seemed suspended on the edge of revelation. The bridge connected stories, not just through events, but through emotion, grief, fear, longing, and obsession. Each instance echoed the others, reinforcing a rhythm that was at once haunting and hypnotic. The motif became a guide leading from Dayton to distant towns, from wartime Europe to post-war America, from the documented to the whispered, creating a continuity that demanded attention and demanded reckoning. The photograph pulsed under my fingers, a quiet insistence that seemed almost alive. Each glance revealed nuances I had not noticed before. A subtle shadow in the girl's eyes, the faint tilt of her head, as if she were aware of being watched. I could feel a tension building in the room, thickening the air. The way shadows lengthen before nightfall, stretching toward you, even when the sun still lingers outside. Something was happening. Something that defied logic, chronology, and reason. I revisited the soldier's diaries, The entries grew more fragmented, more desperate. Sentences trailing off words, crossed-out phrases repeated in a trembling hand. One line read, "I see her in every face, even when I look away." Another, the photograph moves. I cannot hold it still. It was as though his consciousness itself had become entangled with the image, as if reality were bending to accommodate memory grief and something otherworldly that refused to be named. Neighbors' accounts began to converge. Multiple witnesses recalled seeing the soldier at dusk, wandering streets with the photograph held close, murmuring names that were never documented. Some said he would pause at empty homes, staring at the windows, lips moving in quiet supplication. Others reported shadows flickering behind him, as if the girl in the photograph had somehow stepped into the periphery of the real world. The convergence of stories, though inconsistent in detail, created a chilling pattern, one that suggested the impossible was somehow manifesting in the mundane. I returned to Dayton's police files seeking corroboration. Reports of missing children and unexplained sightings were recorded with clinical detachment. Yet contradictions leapt from the pages. Statements clashed. Dates conflicted. Witnesses described impossible circumstances, children appearing in two places at once, doors closing when no one was present. Footsteps echoing in empty hallways. Evidence had vanished. Photographs gone, diaries unaccounted for, notes erased. Every trail seemed to fold back upon itself, leaving only questions that demanded answers, yet defied resolution. The soldier himself became a focal point of tension. I interviewed him cautiously, aware that every word, every hesitation carried weight. His gaze flickered constantly, lips pressed tight, hands shaking slightly as he held the wallet. When asked directly about the photograph, he spoke in fragments. I can't. I only see." His sentences trailed into silence, eyes distant, haunted by something so entirely of this world. The room seemed to darken around him, the shadows deepening, stretching toward corners unseen. I revisited the diary entries once more. A new pattern emerged, references to eyes like mine, to fleeting smiles, to names whispered in the dark. Pages were torn, smudged, water-stained, some illegible. Yet the repetition was undeniable. Every town he had passed, every child he had glimpsed, every photograph he had carried. It all pointed toward the same motif, the same unresolved tension. The climax had arrived not as a single event, but as a crescendo of accumulated impossibilities. The photograph itself began to feel unstable. Details shifted when I looked away, shadows deepening, corners curling, the expression altering subtly. I sensed a presence behind it, a gaze not mine following my own movements. The air grew colder, a faint whispering sound curling around the edges of perception. I could hear breathing, faint, uneven, and not entirely human. The photograph seemed to assert itself, to demand recognition of something beyond rational understanding. Eyewitnesses, who had once recounted only vague impressions, now spoke with increasing urgency. Children remembered fleeting encounters, strangers recalled sudden chills, and neighbors reported the soldier standing in doorways, staring at walls where no child was present. All converged at the same point in time: the presence of the photograph, the anomalies, the sense that something had crossed from memory into the tangible world. It was a junction where fact, folklore, and personal experience collided violently. The diary mentions that on certain nights the girl would appear, sometimes reflected in mirrors, sometimes in shadows. One entry notes, "She comes to the corners of rooms, always watching, always waiting. I cannot speak." I began to understand the climax not as a singular revelation, but as a sustained tension that escalated gradually, a sense of being pulled into a story that spanned continents, years, and the boundary between the living and the spectral. The soldier admitted finally in fragments that the photograph had vanished from his wallet one evening. He retraced his steps. Every room, every street corner, every familiar path. It was gone, yet its presence lingered. Shadows still flickered, whispers persisted, and the sense of being observed remained. The climax was not the disappearance itself, but the haunting insistence of absence, the terror of what remains unseen yet undeniably real. I walked the streets of Dayton, retracing the soldier's route. Houses stood silent, windows dark, yet a weight pressed in the air. The residue of memory trauma, and perhaps something beyond understanding. Footsteps echoed where none should, doors shifted slightly, shadows moved. Each element confirmed the rhythm of the motif. The photograph, the vanished children, the soldiers carrying memories that would not fade. The climax had extended beyond paper, beyond witness, beyond human comprehension, into the very atmosphere of the city itself. And in that realization, I felt the full force of the story. The photograph was gone, yet everything it represented persisted. History's unresolved folklore intertwined with fact, children missing, shadows lengthening, all coalesced into a crescendo of tension, horror, and wonder. The climax was not resolved. It demanded recognition, contemplation, and a confrontation with the boundary where reality ends and the unexplainable begins. The photograph never returned to the soldier's wallet. It had vanished quietly, without explanation. Yet its presence lingered in every corner of his home, in every shadow cast by the late afternoon sun, in every creak of the floorboards. I could feel it still. A weight pressing at the edges of perception, a pull from a world just beyond understanding. Dayton remained unchanged outwardly, but inside the city had been marked, subtly, invisibly, by absence, memory, and a story that refused to end. Neighbors remembered strange moments for years afterward. Flickers in the corner of vision, sudden chills, doors moving against the wind, whispers that seemed to echo without source. Each subtle event became part of the invisible architecture the photograph had left behind. Fact and folklore intertwined so thoroughly that the ordinary could no longer be trusted. The city held its breath, a living archive of moments where reality bent, leaving gaps that imagination, or something more, would always fill. I revisited the soldier's diaries one last time. Pages torn, ink, faded entries ending mid-sentence. Each fragment resonated with unresolved tension. She watches. I cannot leave her behind. One line read. Another, every photograph is a portal. Every shadow carries her presence. The words were not just memories, they were warnings. A legacy of perception and haunting that refused the neat closure official records demanded. Families who had glimpsed the motif continued to report subtle anomalies. Children perceived figures that vanished when approached. Parents felt the weight of attention in empty rooms. Neighbors swore shadows shifted unnaturally. Each observation layered itself upon the historical record, a folk memory in dialogue with the factual, extending the story beyond one photograph, beyond one soldier, beyond Dayton itself. The motif, persistent, insistent, lived on. I walked through the streets the soldier had walked, tracing the rhythm of a past that clung to present air. Each house, each tree, each darkened window whispered fragments, echoes of children, shadows, photographs, faces that should not have existed. Dayton's post-war hum was ordinary, yet under the surface it thrummed with memory absence and subtle menace. The city itself seemed to hold its own story, secreted away beneath sunlit streets and quiet porches. The photograph had become a symbol, a convergence of fact, folklore, and the unexplainable. The girl's eyes, reflected in my memory, mirrored more than my daughter. They mirrored every child lost, every shadow fleeting across a street, every whisper of the impossible that lingers long after the moment has passed. The climax had resolved in disappearance, but the tension, the questions, the haunting presence persisted. Some nights the soldier spoke of dreams, fragments of places he had never visited, children whose faces he did not recognize, voices calling from the edges of memory. The diaries record a quiet desperation. I am followed by faces that do not exist, yet I know them. The photographic motif gone from his hands lived in consciousness, bridging gaps between tangible history and spectral narrative. Even today, families in Dayton and elsewhere remember shadows, fleeting glimpses of the uncanny in ordinary moments. A photograph seen a child remembered a moment of déjà vu. Each instance echoes the motif, reminding the living that the story does not end with absence. The bridge between fact and folklore remains stretching across decades, carrying memory, dread, and fascination. I left Dayton with the photograph imprinted on my mind. Not in my hands, not in any tangible form, but in the pulse of recognition, in the shiver of memory, in the uncanny certainty that some truths are too persistent to be contained. Fact and folklore, history and legend, absence and presence, all converged in the gaze of a child who may have never existed, yet whose eyes haunt the edges of perception still. As I reflect now, the story remains open, unresolved, persistent. What happened to the girl? Where did the photograph go? Did it vanish, or was it always a conduit linking lives, memories, and places across time and space? I do not know. The soldier's account ends here, but the motif continues. Embedded in memory and shadows in the quiet spaces of cities and homes. Waiting, watching, and lingering in ways we cannot fully comprehend. You have just glimpsed another fragment of hidden history. Another echo of the impossible. Another story that refuses closure. Dayton holds its secrets, the shadows keep their watch, and the photograph, real or imagined, remains a portal. A question persists, and it is for you to feel the weight, to sense the absence, to consider the unseen. What would you do if the past stared back at you from the eyes of a stranger? If a fragment of memory, or something beyond, demanded recognition? In Dayton, the story continues quietly, insistently, invisibly, and it waits for those willing to look beyond what is seen. You've just heard another case from Classified History. If you want to uncover more, make sure to subscribe.